All right, so let's dive into something that I think hits close to home for a lot of us in Ontario.
Yeah.
Renovictions.
Oh, yeah.
You're settled in,
Yeah.
you love your place,
Yeah.
and suddenly you get a notice,
Mm-hmm.
an eviction notice,
Hmm.
for renovations.
Right.
It can feel like a real curveball, honestly.
Yeah, for sure.
A bit unsettling.
Definitely raises a lot of questions and concerns.
Yeah. So my first question is...
Good news is Ontario has some of the strongest tenant protections in Canada, especially when it comes to renovictions. So
Okay, good.
we're going to arm you with the knowledge you need to navigate this.
Perfect.
Let's break it down.
Because what actually constitutes a renoviction in Ontario?
Yeah.
It can't just be that the landlord wants to slap on some fresh paint, right?
You're absolutely right. It's not about minor cosmetic touch-ups.
Okay.
The law uses the term extensive renovations,
Aye.
and it's pretty specific. Think about it this way. The renovations have to be so substantial that it's basically impossible for you to live there safely and comfortably while the work is being done.
Right.
We're talking major overhauls, things that might require permits,
Okay.
maybe even structural changes.
So gutting an entire kitchen, redoing plumbing, things like that.
Exactly. And even then, the landlord can't just decide to do these renovations and expect you to pack up.
Right.
There's a very strict legal process they must follow, starting with a Form N13.
Okay, so Form N13.
Yeah.
That's the official starting pistol for a renoviction.
Precisely. This form is the landlord's legal notice to you outlining their intention to evict for renovations.
Okay.
And here's where it gets interesting. Even if the landlord is planning legitimate, extensive renovations, they can't just hand you this form and say, see ya.
Right, there's got to be more to it than that. What kind of time frame are we talking about?
Ontario law mandates that you must be given at least 120 days notice before you have to move out.
Okay.
That's a solid 4 months to figure out your next steps.
That's a decent amount of time, at least.
Yeah.
But let's be real, moving isn't cheap.
Right.
And finding a new place in Ontario's rental market
Yeah.
can be a headache.
It is.
Where does that leave you financially?
That's a critical point, and it's where a lot of people don't realize their rights.
Okay.
Ontario law requires the landlord to compensate you in a renoviction situation.
Okay.
Typically, this means you're entitled to 3 months' rent.
3 months, that's pretty significant. Is that the only option, though?
There's another option, which is that the landlord can offer you another comparable unit in the same building.
Right.
But if they don't have a suitable unit available, that 3 months rent compensation kicks in.
Interesting. So you pack up, hopefully find a decent temporary place. The renovations happen. Does that mean you're just out of luck once the work is done?
Not necessarily. This is where things get really interesting because Ontario law also grants you the right of return.
Of return, you mean I can actually move back into my old place after the renovations are done?
Exactly. You have the legal right to return to that renovated unit.
Yeah. Wow.
And here's the kicker at your old rent, plus any legally allowed increases.
Okay.
So the landlord can't use the renovation as an excuse to suddenly jack up the rent sky high.
That's huge. It means even if you're temporarily displaced, you're not necessarily losing your home.
That's the idea behind this protection, but of course, this all assumes the landlord is playing by the rules and the renoviction is genuinely legitimate.
Right.
What if something feels off?
That's exactly what I was wondering. What if you get that N13 form and you suspect the landlord might be trying to pull a fast one?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they just want to get you out to raise the rent for a new tenant.
Right.
What can you do?
You absolutely have the right to challenge that notice.
Okay.
And the first step is demanding proof.
So you're not just taking their word for it?
Not at all. You can request documentation that shows these renovations are truly extensive as the law requires.
Okay.
Think building permits, architectural plans, detailed descriptions of the work.
Got it.
Anything that proves these aren't just minor updates disguised as a major overhaul.
Okay, so you're essentially saying, show me the receipts.
Right.
You have a right to see the evidence.
Precisely. Don't be afraid to push back and demand transparency.
Okay.
You have a right to know what's going on and whether this eviction is truly justified.
Right.
But let's say you do all that, you gather your evidence, and the landlord is still insisting on the eviction. Things escalate. What happens then?
That's where it starts to feel a bit intimidating. Do you just have to accept it at that point?
No, not at all. That's where the Landlord and Tenant Board, or LTB, comes into play.
I've heard of the LTB, but to be honest, it sounds a bit daunting. What exactly is it?
It's basically a specialized body that handles disputes between landlords and tenants in Ontario.
Okay.
Think of it as a neutral third party who can step in and make a judgment based on the law.
Right.
So if you and your landlord can't agree on the renoviction, you can file an application with the LTB and they'll hear both sides of the story.
So it's like having a referee who knows all the rules of the game.
That's a great way to put it. They'll review the evidence, listen to both arguments, and ultimately determine whether the eviction is valid according to Ontario law.
I'm guessing all that documentation we talked about earlier, the N13, the proof of renovations, any communication with the landlord, that's all crucial when you go before the LTB.
It's absolutely essential.
Okay.
The more evidence you have to support your case, the stronger your position will be.
So it really is all about being informed and proactive. Any final words of wisdom for our listener who might be facing this right now?
If you get any notice, even if it seems legitimate on the surface,
Yeah.
don't panic, but don't just take it at face value either.
Right. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to something as important as your home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Review your tenant rights. There are tons of resources available online, and seriously consider consulting with a paralegal who specializes in this area.
Okay.
They can provide guidance specific to your situation. You don't have to navigate this alone.
That's a relief to know those resources out there.
Yeah.
I know we've been focusing on the legal side of things, but renovictions aren't just abstract legal matters.
Right.
They impact real people's lives. What are some of the human costs involved?
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the steps and procedures, but we can't forget the emotional toll this takes on tenants.
Right.
Imagine the stress of having to pack up your entire life, potentially uproot your family, and the uncertainty of finding a new place to live.
Yeah.
All while knowing you might have to move again in a few months if you choose to exercise your right of return.
It's disruptive on so many levels.
Yeah.
And even with that 3-month rent compensation,
Yeah.
moving isn't cheap. Plus, what if the only places you can find in the meantime
Right.
have higher rent than what you were paying before?
You're hitting on a real vulnerability here. That 3 months rent might not cover all the costs.
Right.
And some tenants might end up in a worse financial situation than before the renoviction.
Right.
This is especially tough on folks who are on fixed incomes, have limited savings, or are already struggling to make ends meet.
It highlights the fact that these situations aren't just about legal battles. They're about people's lives, their sense of stability, and their financial well-being.
For sure.
It makes you wonder if that 3 months rent is truly adequate compensation for everything a tenant goes through.
That's a valid question, and one that's being raised more and more.
Yeah.
The current system focuses on making sure the eviction process is legal,
Right.
but there's a growing conversation about whether it's truly equitable for tenants,
Okay.
especially those who are most vulnerable.
Speaking of layers, let's go back to that idea of challenging a notice.
Mm-hmm.
If you suspect the landlord isn't being upfront,
Yeah.
what kind of evidence is most helpful in proving your case?
You want to focus on anything that contradicts the landlord's claim that the renovations are extensive and necessitate your eviction.
Okay.
For instance, if they're claiming major plumbing work, but you've never had any plumbing issues,
Right.
that's a red flag. Or if they're saying they need to gut the entire unit, but you've noticed they're only doing cosmetic updates in other units. Something you want to document.
So it's about looking for inconsistencies, things that don't add up,
Right.
and gathering any proof you can to support your suspicion.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of detailed notes.
Okay.
Keep a record of any conversations you have with the landlord, any maintenance requests you've made, and even take photos or videos if you see evidence that contradicts their claims.
It sounds like being organized and documenting everything is key, but let's say you've done all that batter, you're confident the landlord is trying to pull something, but they're still not backing down. Is the LTB really the only option at that point?
The LTD is certainly the most formal route,
Okay.
and it's often the most effective in resolving disputes, especially when there's a clear violation of the law. However, there are other options to explore before going that route.
Such as?
Well, for starters, mediation can be a good alternative.
Okay.
This involves a neutral third party who helps facilitate a conversation between you and the landlord to try and reach a mutually agreeable solution. It can be less adversarial than going before the LTB, and sometimes just having a mediator present can help clarify misunderstandings or lead to a compromise.
So it's more about finding common ground than winning a battle.
That's the spirit of mediation. And even if you ultimately decide to file an application with the LTB, having attempted mediation can sometimes demonstrate to the board that you are willing to try and resolve things amicably.
That makes sense. It shows you're not just jumping straight to the most aggressive option. But what if mediation fails or the landlord just flat out refuses to participate? Is the LTB the only recourse then?
In those situations, the LTB might be the most effective path.
Okay.
But even then, it's worth considering if you have the time, resources, and emotional energy to navigate that process.
I can imagine it could be pretty draining. What makes you say that?
Filing an application, gathering evidence, preparing your arguments, attending hearings.
Right.
It can be a lot to handle, especially if you're already dealing with the stress of a potential move.
Right.
And it's important to be realistic about the potential outcomes.
What do you mean?
The LTB's primary role is to uphold the law.
Yeah.
But it's not always a guaranteed win for the tenant. If the landlord can provide sufficient evidence to justify the eviction, the LTB might rule in their favor.
So even if you feel like something's not right, there's no guarantee the LTB will see it your way.
That's why it's crucial to have a strong case, which goes back to the importance of documentation.
Right.
But even with solid evidence, there's always a degree of uncertainty.
Okay.
And that uncertainty, combined with the time and energy involved, can be emotionally taxing for tenants.
It sounds like there are no easy answers when it comes to challenging a renoviction.
That's true. It's a complex process with a lot of moving parts, and it requires careful consideration of your individual circumstances and resources.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's about empowering yourself with knowledge so you can make informed decisions.
I think that's a key takeaway for our listeners. You mentioned earlier that consulting with a paralegal is a good idea. Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. A paralegal specializing in landlord-tenant law can be invaluable in a situation like this. Okay.
They have a deep understanding of the Residential Tenancies Act. They know the intricacies of the LTB process, and they can provide guidance tailored to your specific situation.
So they're like your legal navigator, helping you chart a course through this potentially tricky terrain.
That's a great way to put it. They can help you assess the strength of your case, advise you on the best course of action, and even represent you at the LTB if necessary.
It sounds like having that expert in your corner could really alleviate some of the stress and uncertainty, especially if you're feeling overwhelmed or unsure about what steps to take.
Exactly. And remember, we're talking about your home here, something that's incredibly important on both a practical and emotional level.
Right.
Having a paralegal on your side can provide peace of mind knowing that someone is looking out for your best interests and guiding you through the process.
It's about having someone to advocate for you and make sure your rights are being protected. But what about the cost to Brown? I imagine hiring a paralegal can be an added financial burden on top of everything else.
It's true that there are fees involved.
Yeah, but many paralegals offer free initial consultations, which can be a great way to get an overview of your situation and understand your options. And in some cases, the LTB might even order the landlord to cover your legal fees if they are found to have acted in bad faith.
That's good to know. So it's not necessarily an insurmountable financial hurdle.
Exactly. And it's important to weigh the potential benefits against the cost.
Right.
Having expert legal guidance can significantly increase your chances of a favorable outcome, whether it's negotiating a better settlement with your landlord or successfully challenging the eviction at the LTB.
That makes a lot of sense. So to recap for our listeners who might be in this situation, document everything, consider mediation, don't be afraid to seek legal advice, and know that you're not alone in this.
Well said. Now, I know we've been focusing a lot on the tenant's perspective, but I think it's important to acknowledge that most landlords aren't out there trying to exploit the system. Sometimes renovations are genuinely necessary for the safety and well-being of all residents.
That's a fair point, and I imagine there are landlords who are genuinely concerned about the impact renovations have on their tenants and want to make the process as smooth as possible.
Absolutely, and I think that's where communication and transparency become so crucial.
Yeah.
Imagine a landlord who proactively informs tenants about upcoming renovations, provides detailed timelines and explanations, and even involves tenants in the decision-making process where feasible.
That would make a huge difference. It would give tenants a sense of agency and control rather than feeling like they're being subjected to decisions made without their input.
Exactly. And it could also help build trust and understanding between landlords and tenants, creating a more positive rental experience for everyone involved.
I love that idea. It's about shifting the dynamic from an adversarial one to a more collaborative one where both parties are working together to find solutions that benefit everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself, and I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah, it really does make you think how we can create a fairer system for everyone you know.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From the legal ins and outs to the human impact of renovictions. So what's the key message you want our listeners to walk away with?
If there's one thing I hope our listeners take to heart, it's this. When it comes to your home, knowledge truly is power.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to ask questions, seek out resources, and stand up for your rights.
Absolutely well said. And remember, folks, you can always revisit this episode if you need a refresher. We've packed a lot in. But before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder. You know, we've focused on protecting tenants, which is crucial.
Yeah.
But what about landlords? What are some ways landlords can approach renovations in a way that's less disruptive and more equitable for their tenants?
It's a great question. It challenges us to think about solutions from both sides. It's not about pitting landlords against tenants. It's about finding ways to create a better rental experience for everyone.
Exactly, because ultimately, a healthy rental market benefits everyone involved.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
I agree to our amazing listeners out there. We hope this exploration of renovictions has left you feeling informed and empowered. Remember, stay curious, keep learning, and advocate for your rights. Until next time, happy renting.